Tonight, we pay tribute to a man who, in his very, very short time here on Earth, he made so many of us, his fans, change the way that we not only think, but really the way that we live. Today is February 23rd, and 25 years ago this month, William Melvin Hicks, a.k.a. Bill Hicks, as he's most famously known, released what at least I consider a classic stand-up album called Relentless. And within this timeless set, he touched on themes and ideas that still resonate today. Religion, politics, philosophy. I mean, there really wasn't anything that he wasn't afraid to touch. And most of all, he challenged his listener to both challenge authority and at least what we've come to know as accepted truth. And sadly, just as he was finally emerging from that underground cult status, he tragically died at the age of 32. A flame snuffed out too quickly. That anniversary is also this month, in just a couple days around the corner. Assisting us in tonight's tribute and commemoration, Cynthia True, author of the biography American Scream, The Bill Hicks Story. She's going to share a bunch of stories from the book and hopefully help us understand what made Bill tick, what made him laugh, what pissed him off, which was probably a lot of things, and what he saw as his ultimate mission. All right, people, remember when I just mentioned that we were really busy during the off-season, so to speak? We've decided to continue our foray into social media and stop keeping our little program our little secret. So on top of Twitter and Facebook, YouTube, iTunes, yada, 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 we're also going to start doing Instagram, if that is something that you're so inclined to do. And we're going to make this one a little bit different than Facebook and Twitter. We're going to go more behind the scenes. But I guess here's the real kicker. We're going to experience this together. Although I signed up for our Instagram handle at Mind's Eye Show, just like the other ones, at the beginning of the winter hiatus, I haven't posted anything really in anticipation of this moment. We're going to experience this together. Right now, I'm going to post our first pic on Instagram, and it is, like I said, keeping to our promise, going to give you just a little behind-the-scenes picture. So I hope you enjoy. Check it out. Please join us on all our social media stuff. Our handle's all the same, at Mind's Eye Show. And if you get lost, just go over to our website, themindseyemedia.com. And please, while stopping there, don't forget to check out our brand spanking new blog entry, which I just completed. And this is in honor of Black History Month. The conspiracy to kill Martin Luther King. Don't call it a theory. Check it out. Again, go to our website, themindseyemedia.com. I really think this is a very thought-provoking piece, and it's something that I believe Bill Hicks, the man who our show is dedicated tonight, would have approved of. And I really don't say that lightly, nor just a way to advertise the blog. No further delay. Up next, our tribute to American stand-up comedian, social critic, and satirist Bill Hicks continues with Emmy winner Cynthia True. Back in a Mind's Eye moment on Z Talk Radio. Big welcome to our tribute party, Cynthia True, author of American Scream, The Bill Hicks Story. Can you believe it has been a quarter of century since the release of Relentless, and really almost that same amount of time since we've heard his voice? Is it me, or do we need Bill Hicks more than ever?
Oh, yes, we do absolutely need Bill Hicks more than ever. I can't even imagine what he would have to say to the Trump voter. Yeah, it would be great to hear that. And I think that there would be so many, clearly so many more forums today for him to do that unedited.
Now, let me preface my first question with, I pray at the altar of Bill Hicks, so this is not disrespectful in any way, but it's a question that's been rattling around my brain, Cynthia, and kind of go back and forth on the answer a lot. And the question is, was he a genius or a great artist? And let me just explain briefly. Geniuses are usually prolific at a variety of things, while artists generally just one medium. But Hicks, he wasn't really just a comedian or a comic. He was as much as a satirist and a philosopher as a comedian. So in your opinion, was he a genius or a great artist?
Oh, I mean, I don't, genius is such a strange sort of thing. I mean, I don't know how you identify someone as a genius, but certainly he was a genius comedian, and the other things that you mentioned, being a philosopher, a great writer. I think that he certainly had all of the elements that any truly great comedian, whether you're talking about Louis C.K. or Dave Chappelle, or Bill, he possessed, Richard Pryor, he possessed all of those things. So I don't know, exactly the semantics of it, but I would certainly say that he was, absolutely exceptional in what he did.
What was it about Bill Hicks that inspired you to write a book about his life?
I think that Bill was the first comedian I ever heard who not only didn't sugarcoat things much, but still managed to be very, very funny. But he really challenged my way of thinking about the world. And that sort of blew my mind, that he could really cause that kind of shift in perception when you were listening to him. And I just had never had that experience with any comedian. Probably still haven't really to that degree.
And obviously the whole show we're going to be talking about Bill Hicks, but I want to talk about you just for the briefest of moments. And you're a bit of a Renaissance woman, Cynthia. Just give a quick give a quick snapshot. Well, don't underestimate yourself there. Give our listener a quick snapshot of yourself, and also kind of what you've been doing for the last 15 years since the biography came out.
Oh my God. It's so scary when you say that. It's gone so fast. I did a sort of reactionary thing after I finished writing about Bill, which was about a 3-year, almost 4-year project, and I spent most of that time alone and writing about this guy. And so when I was finished, all I wanted in the whole world was to be in a room with other writers. And I feel like I never wanted to be alone working like that again. And I also wanted to do something much lighter, and I got into comedy writing. And so I've been writing for TV for quite a long time, for cartoons and other comedy stuff. And then I've recently written a thriller. It's kind of a dark sexual thriller that's what I'm working on right now. And I created a cartoon called The Mighty Bee for Nickelodeon. And so, I really went to the other end of the pop culture spectrum. And it felt pretty great.
and don't be too modest.
I look back very fondly on writing that book. It was the most rewarding thing I've ever done as a writer. There was something very particular about Bill's story and the way that it felt that he had been cut off. And I think what really attracted me to the story was that the story was, in a sense, still unfolding. I started writing about Bill only 3 or 4 years after his death. And there really was this sense amongst all of his friends and, of course, his fans and critics that this guy had been almost cut off mid-sentence. And so it was a real opportunity to kind of try to tell that story and look at the ways in which he had been sort of shut up in a way that wouldn't exactly happen today. Yeah.
Now, Hicks' style of comedy was confrontational, to say the least. But his first 2 live comedy CDs, Dangerous and Relentless, that perfectly describes his on-stage personality. Talk a little bit about his evolution as a comedian.
Well, his evolution as a comedian, when he was young, what was interesting about him is he started off very strong, but in a fairly conventional way. In a good way, in a solid way, but he started doing the kind of material that, let's say, Seinfeld would do, or Leno, any really smart comedian who is planning to make a fairly non-controversial career. And he was such a virtuoso at that stuff. And when you look at, like I said, when you look at his stuff from when he's younger, he had this A set from a very young age, maybe 19 or 20 years old, where he could have easily just sort of ridden a, let's say, kind of commercial wave and become that feel-good comic that everybody just loves, who has great timing and he's really kind of an all-American kid. And his concerns were, involved his family and church and kind of sort of daily concerns that one has. And as he got older, I think having mastered the form, it sort of freed him to start really playing with the content in a way that was really, as you said, confrontational and also just sort of mind expanding. And his own mind was expanding so much. He never stopped searching. He never stopped kind of opening his mind and challenging himself. And I think that he didn't want to just do impressions of his dad. He kind of outgrew that. That was fun when he was a kid. And like I said, for a lot of comedians, that material could carry you for a career. But Bill kept pushing past that into questioning other systems, larger systems than the family, let's say, or school or whatever. He started questioning not just politics, but the very way we see things. I mean, one of the things that I love most about Bill was that, again, he could have been content to criticize American foreign policy. The British were eating that up. And he didn't stop at that. The next thing he did was, as you know, on Relentless, this long, unapologetic piece about pornography and how great it is. And what I really respect about Bill is even in a time where he's starting to get that critical acclaim that he's so kind of hungered for, and rightfully so, because he's so good, and on some level he knows that. Rather than being comfortable in that, he just goes and takes this topic that is very uncomfortable for everybody, and he starts challenging our notions about what is pornography. And he even does a riff that is certainly not pro Clarence Thomas, but it's about how, like, if you think Clarence Thomas is bad, you should see you should see the kind of stuff I get up to vis-a-vis pornography and all of that. So I really love all of that stuff. I love all of his pro-drug stuff. And again, not because it wasn't that he was trying to just be a badass. It was that he was really, what he was really talking about in both of those instances was hypocrisy. And I love that. That's why those bits are so smart. But there's a lot of less risque ways he could have chosen to confront people about those things. And I just love that he never let himself get comfortable.
And we're going to go into more about some of the themes that he talked about in a little bit. I want to just talk a little bit more about his life. And what about offstage? What was he like? You had a chance to speak a lot of his family and friends. What did they say about him when he was offstage?
Two things came up a lot, which was that he had he was kind of proper in a way. He was very, very polite. He had a real Southern gentleman quality to him, and many people have told me that. And so there was, as there so often is, a real kind of dichotomy between his onstage presence and his offstage presence. The other thing about him is that there was this constant search and this constant, I guess, engagement, you would call it, in just life. He was always reading a great book or wanted to go see a great movie or eat at this amazing restaurant he heard about. It was though he filled all of his time off stage with searching for stuff and really living his life, very fully, which I know sounds kind of corny, but really, his friends would say to me, with Bill, it was never like he just came over to hang out and see what happened. He would always come over with a mission. It was always, we're going to go to the best barbecue place you've ever been to today, and then I have this record that I'm going to play for you, and we're going to listen to it 4 times. And, hey, I've been reading the Bhagavad Gita, and, he was constantly just looking into stuff and learning stuff. He was like the sponge, that person that just wants to constantly have their mind pushed and opened. And he really kind of asked that of his friends and took a lot of joy in exposing his friends to new stuff and new ideas in the same way he did his audiences. I think that's one thing that, in a funny way, kind of similar.
It was obvious for his parents that even at a young, early age that he was different. What was it about his childhood that would ultimately influence his comedy?
Well, I think that, like a lot of sensitive souls, Bill sensed that something was rotten in Denmark. And it's not that he didn't have a nice childhood on paper. He lived in a very, kind of a nice upper middle class enclave. He had two parents who were very committed to him, loved him very much, and a brother and sister who he was pretty close to, actually particularly his brother. And friends. He was this kid who was apparently a kind of a baseball prodigy. People thought he could have gone pro if he wanted to. School came easily, all of that stuff. But he was very bright and very sensitive, and I think that there was something about the kind of cookie cutter suburban world that he was living in, which also happened to be, right smack in the middle of the Bible Belt. There was something about that childhood, even though things seemed sort of okay on the surface, that he really questioned. I think that he questioned the unquestioningness of it all from a very early age. And I'm not sure exactly where people get that. I don't know what it is in a family system that makes one child totally cool with that and seemingly not in any kind of epic struggle. And whereas for someone like Bill, that, as you point out, existed from a very young age, and certainly the minute he discovered comedy, it was like a lifeline for him, and he seemed kind of almost unable to stop from the moment he discovered it. It was more and more and more, just absorbing Richard Pryor, Woody Allen, Lenny Bruce, and Sam Kinison, of course, and then just this hunger to write his own stuff, and telling, from like the age of 12, telling these very cute but kind of disturbing jokes. I mean, disturbing in the sense that it would make the grown-ups take notes. And I think that he was a bit mischievous in that way. I think it gave him a lot of pleasure to sort of upset the grown-ups.
And like many great artists, he really wasn't appreciated enough in his time, particularly by the majority of the people and his own country, from his own country.
Right.
And he had somewhat of a love-hate relationship, and really it was from both sides with home country, USA.
Yeah, I think that he did have a love-hate relationship with the United States, like any sentient person who loves this country, but also sees and is therefore very bitterly disappointed by its shortcomings and by the things that he sees as hypocritical and very hurtful to the poor, to the vulnerable, to the rest of the world. I mean, it's sort of that dichotomy that many of us live with today. We're disgusted and terrified, and there's also a lot of love.
Yeah, I mean, he was a bit of a cynic, but there's that old saying, a cynic is just a jaded optimist.
Yeah, and I would say that that's very true. I think for Bill, I think that he was a very romantic, maybe more than an idealist, although certainly an idealist in certain ways. And yes, you're right. I think that a lot of Bill's anger or peak came from that disappointment. I think that his issues with Jay Leno, which people talk about a lot, had to do with being disappointed in your idol. And I think that in a similar way, he held this country to a high standard and was sort of crushed by certain things that he saw as an adult that he just could not get his head around, which I think is quite a familiar feeling for a lot of us right now.
Most definitely, and that's what's great about his stand-up Relentless, is that it's classic and timeless, because you can really just substitute some of the names that he's talking about for what's going on now, and everything that he's talking about still resonates today. That's what I think is the importance of Bill Hicks.
I mean, Relentless is really, a lot of it is talking about the Trump voter, the unquestioning herd, and also just sort of the unquestioning part of our society that can really lead us down obviously leads people down a bad path, and Relentless is so much about that on so many different levels. So yeah, it's sadly prescient, and at the same time, it's wonderful to be able to listen to that stuff, because it's a bit of a mental salve for me, at least.
Let's pause for a momentary break. When we come back, we're going to talk a little bit more about the classic album Relentless, since that is what brought us together today. But we're also going to focus a little bit more and dive into Bill's belief system: God, death, religion, conspiracies, and of course his most famous philosophy: it's just a ride. All when TME returns. We're back on The Mind's Eye with Cynthia True, and we're discussing stories from her biography, American Scream, The Bill Hicks Story. Now, there's such limited material on Bill. And normally, after somebody dies, you're going to get this huge flux of material. But that really just hasn't happened. I mean, after speaking to his family and friends, I mean, do you know, are there any unreleased material in the vault somewhere?
You know, I'm really not sure about that. I suspect that there may be, and it does seem like the estate has certainly released a few more things over the years. By no means do I think that I've listened to everything. I know that, you know, there was so much that Kevin Booth and those guys, for example, taped over the years. I have to think that there's a wealth of material there. So, no, I mean, I kind of think there's probably a lot more, but I can't say for a fact.
I'm kind of hoping till they, you know, if it's going to be released, I imagine maybe the 25th anniversary of his death, which I believe comes up next year or 2 years from now. Hopefully we'll get some more.
That might be. That would be really, really wonderful for his fans.
And there have been some fantastic material that has been released, particularly in the form of documentaries. Russell Crowe announced in 2012 that he's going to direct some type of Bill Hicks topic, but I mean, unless it kind of went under my radar, I don't think anything has come out about that. Any news on that front that you're aware of?
No, you know, I had absolutely nothing to do with that, so I have no idea. I did hear something through the grapevine, and then it seemed like it just sort of went by the wayside, as these things do.
Yeah, I definitely think there's a lot left to be said about Bill Hicks, particularly in this time that we're talking about right now. And let's go a little bit more into his belief systems and the album Relentless. We'll kind of combine the two, since really they reflect each other. And let's talk about his most famous philosophy: it's just a ride. Tell me where that came from.
You know, I don't know precisely the kind of evolution of that idea, except that he was certainly, you know, he was very steeped in the Christian religion as a child, and as an adult, he certainly looked into many other philosophies, including Buddhism. Interested him a lot. He was very into transcendental meditation. You know, he was a seeker, and I think that the thing he sort of came to through a lot of study and a lot of delving was this idea, that, you know, our beliefs are just that. They're just our beliefs. It's just what we've been told. We don't know anything for sure. And yeah, this is just a ride. And to me, whenever I hear that, I always think that he's sort of telling us to let go of the ego a little bit.
Well, we'll talk a little bit about, he had a lot of themes that came up, particularly religion and spirituality, which you went into the book and you talked about a couple of arguments that he had with his father that really reflected his own belief. And so talk a little bit about his constant conflict with spirituality, religion, and I guess sort of a skeptic point of view.
My sense is that Bill was a very spiritual guy, and in some ways still very steeped in the religion that he was raised in. I don't think that it ever kind of leaves you. I think it's always there, even if you're rebelling against it. And I think that he certainly believed in the concept of Jesus and the really fundamental sort of, you know, underpinnings of Christianity, which are beautiful. And he believed in those things. What he was railing against, of course, was the hypocrisy surrounding that. And particularly, I think what particularly drove him crazy, and what he was raised kind of seeing in the 80s, was the evolution of Christianity as a politic. And I think that he despised that, and he saw how dangerous it was. And I think that was the kind of thing that he was really, at the end of the day, kind of arguing with his parents, was the good of organized religion. Not the beliefs themselves exactly, but the sort of perversion of those beliefs and he used to do this very funny thing about how the spiritual, the kind of religious questions that he and his family had were, if you hit someone's Volvo, if you scratch someone's Volvo, do you leave a note? These are the moral questions so he was kind of making fun of those things, but it remained a deep concern. And I do think that in many ways, like Kinnison, questions of morality really, really interested him his whole life. He wasn't the kind of person just went, I'm agnostic. I don't really screw with that stuff. I don't believe in any of it. And he wasn't a Bill Maher where he was sort of dismissive of the whole thing, because I think that he felt very attached to those ideas in many ways, if you know what I mean. As much as he wanted to reshape and look into them, those were really his concerns. And I think he was very interested in the afterlife and in the concept of a spirituality that kind of connects us all. I think that's some of what his interest in mushrooms had to do with that, the idea of a superego and all those kinds of spiritual concerns. But he was certainly not a fan of the conventional kind of track. I mean, he didn't respect the fact that these institutions weren't evolving, and he certainly felt like they were very, Christianity in particular is very, very stunted in our society and abused.
Did Bill believe in God and life after death?
I would say, from what I have read and heard, I would say absolutely he believed in God, 100%. What form that took, deeper question, but absolutely he believed in God. And your other question was life after death?
Yeah, what was his beliefs in that regard?
I don't know precisely. That's such a, how many of us have 100% clarity on this topic ourselves, It's like, who knows? Maybe he felt different on a Wednesday than he did on a Monday, but I would say that the closer he got to his own mortality, I think that he certainly had a sense of there being something larger. And like a lot of people faced with terminal illness, I think it was something that he began to think about a lot and hope for. And then on some level believe in, yeah. It's sort of hard to say because you don't know how an average 32-year-old, I mean, God, he was so young, and you don't know how, these things are shifting in all of us at that age. And for someone like Bill, who was constantly questioning everything, I'm sure there were constant shifts. But I think that when you're faced with something as unusual as knowing that you're going to die at that age, your belief system changes quite a lot.
Yeah, I imagine it's fluctuating all the time, and
Yeah,
I can definitely relate because I'm in that age range right now, and it's constantly flux. I mean, day to day for me, I go back and forth on it, particularly when interviewing people when we talk about such heavy things like that.
Right. I mean, talk to me on a Monday, and I would say there's nothing after you're put in the ground. It's just nothingness, and then another day I think, oh no, there's something else. There's got to be something else. There's got to be reincarnation. There's got to be, I think that he was like a lot of us, looking into those questions all the time.
Let's focus a little bit more on his album Relentless and some of the material that he talked about, because it really does, essentially, it's a microcosm of everything that he talked about throughout his comedic career. Hypocrisy of religion, politics, the manipulation of media by the runners, war, secularism, sexual regulation. So, I mean, there's a lot of stuff that he talked about. When it comes to Relentless, or really any particular skit, do you have a favorite, Cynthia?
I would say that Drugs Have Done Great Things is a favorite for me. And I also, again, I love all that pornography stuff, mostly because I find it so incredibly brave. Like I said earlier, when he was doing Relentless, he was at a point where a lot of, he was getting quite a bit of attention, and he could have kind of continued to sail along on this criticism of American foreign policy and, pop culture institutions and all of this kind of stuff. And that liberals like us, just lap up. And instead he went to a very uncomfortable place. He didn't let anybody relax. And I think that for him to stand up in a theater in London and do, 30 minutes on pornography is unbelievably gutsy. And I love that. And I also just love him really making mincemeat of the morality behind it, and the people, this idea that no artistic merit causes sexual thought. Well, that's every commercial you see on television. That whole thing, I think, is brilliant. And then, I love the Keith Richards stuff. It never gets old. It's great. It's great material, and it's unapologetic, and I love that about him. Bill really didn't care about getting cute. I mean, he would really give it to you straight. He asked a lot of the audience, and I think it's down to his brilliance as a writer and as a performer, obviously, that he was able to keep people laughing, because he didn't soften it much.
Yeah, it was a little rough around the edges. It's funny that you mentioned that pornography skit. I mean, it's a phenomenal skit. But one of the great things I loved about Bill Hicks is that he would just drop these little notes and these little statements inside of these skits that he wouldn't even touch on at all, but it would just be mind-blowing. So, like, for example, just in the middle of that pornography skit, he's talking about how we solve some type of issue with it, and he just drops this little thing. He says, outer space awaits our presence. We are better and more unique creatures than this, and all of our eternity is our playground. And then he just completely continued with the rest of the skit. And I'm just sitting there for 10 minutes just thinking about that statement in itself, and not even the skit. I mean, this is what makes Bill Hicks great, or at least partly what made him great.
Oh, no, you're right. I mean, who else does that? That's such a Hicksian, that is so specific to him. Only he would, you're right, work something like that in there, and not, he doesn't call it back, really, nothing. He just puts that out there and keeps going, and it really, brings this depth to the work that's, the writing is just so good. You're on this one track, and then he drops this other thing, just beautifully phrased, funny, true, and your mind is kind of blown at the same time you're laughing. It's an unusual feeling.
And when you have a statement like that and you just put that out there, and that's a perspective, and this is something that he said that was partially carved by some of his drug experiences, which you have briefly touched on. Go a little bit more about that, because he really did have a complicated relationship with drugs.
Well, on a personal level, I don't think he had a terribly complicated relationship with drugs, in the sense that he was a young man in his 20s, he was drinking a lot, he was partying a lot, he was doing a lot of drugs, and then he stopped. And I don't mean to say that he stopped, and it took him a try or two, but then he stopped. So if you think about it, this was somebody who really only had a very compulsive relationship with alcohol and drugs for maybe 4 or 5 years. It's not like he spent, he's no Keith Richards. I mean, this is a guy who by age, I think 28 or 29, I might be off a little bit, but I think he wasn't older than 28. He'd completely cleaned up. I mean, he was done with that stuff. The only exception to that was that he would very occasionally go out and do a quote-unquote heroic dose of mushrooms with his friends, which again he thought of as kind of he didn't think of that as partying anyway, but kind of a necessary mind expansion. And so I would say that in a way he had a very clear relationship to that stuff. He knew he couldn't drink, and like a lot of really great artists, I think at the end of the day, once drugs and alcohol began to hurt his comedy, once he began to feel that it wasn't turning him on to new stuff, but it was hampering him, he stopped, because comedy was always the higher purpose. That was a real clear thing for him. And at the point that drugs and alcohol started to get in the way of that, I think it was a pretty clear and easy choice for him. What's interesting about him, is somebody who went to AA and was extremely committed to his sobriety, and helped a lot of other people get sober, by the way. I mean, he was always, I can't tell you how many comics I've run into who said, Bill took me to my first meeting, or Bill talked to me about, so he was 100%. There was no kind of, I'm off the wagon with Bill. But what's fascinating about it, again, is that he could be sober in his own life, but as a performer, continue to do very funny and very real pieces like drugs have done great things, or I've had a great time on drugs. I don't do drugs anymore, but I had a great time on drugs, and these are the things that they did for me. And to be able to think about it in that way without sort of subscribing, let's say, to the kind of ideology of recovery and all, that's very interesting to me, to be able to hold those two ideas in your mind. I personally have to be sober, and I believe in AA, and it helps me so much, and all of these people that I know, and yes, but at the same time, I'm able to also hold this idea intellectually that drugs have done great things, and I really had a great time. I'm not going to sit here and say it was all bad or don't do drugs, kids. That's not what, he had no interest in the preachy part of it, and I think he hated that kind of thinking and that kind of, he wanted no part of that, and I love that about him.
And clearly he wasn't a black and white thinker really ever with anything. You mentioned how he helped a few of his friends within the industry get clean themselves. What did his peers actually think of him from within the industry? What was his opinion? Was he loved? Was he hated?
Oh, he was really loved. I mean, I know that when someone's gone, people speak of them in particularly rosy terms. I'm not saying he never had issues with anybody, but I would say that, number one, he was one of those people who was such a light on stage that even in an intensely competitive and sort of notoriously bitchy atmosphere, like, a comedy club backstage, I think that he was one of those guys where they just really had to hand it to him. I don't think there was anybody there going, it was like, oh, this guy, this is the guy, clearly from a very young age. Even like, Kinniston would get upset with him and stuff, but I think a lot of that was just sort of a weird kind of rivalry combined with a kind of brotherly love toward him. But so I would say that he certainly had everyone's respect, and people were in awe of him. I think during his drinking days, there were certainly some moments with people for sure, and I've had comedians say to me, "Oh, he said this to me and did that to me," but the thing is that 90% of them say to me, and we laughed about it later. I mean, again, this was a kid; he was in his 20s, and he was such an old soul, but he really was very young. And this whole period of drinking and partying and whatever, maybe trashing hotel room or something, this is for a period of like 4 years. I mean, it's really kind of brief. And as soon as he got his act together, I mean, he certainly made amends with a lot of people, and people just adored him. The only thing I would say is that, he was not somebody who hung out a lot, like a lot of people who get sober. He tended to kind of do his thing, do his act and get out of there. So he wasn't a guy who was like hanging out a whole lot. He wasn't like Mr. Social. He loved to just go back to his hotel room and play Nintendo and call friends of his, and he loved to talk on the phone. He was a great conversationalist. But that's the thing with Bill, he wanted to go deep. He didn't want to just sit there and shoot the shit in a comedy club and where everybody's drinking and whatever. He was done. He had done it. He preferred to go home, read a great book, play video games, watch some porn, talk to a friend, whatever. He was kind of had his own thing going on. And he also, one fun thing about him is that once the drinking years are done, and probably even during, he loved to eat. He really loved great food. That was a huge pleasure for him to go out for a beautiful meal after a set. And he would always try to find like the great thing in whatever city he was in. And a lot of comics and, club owners and stuff would tell me of like going with Bill in search of, whatever that city had to offer. So he was very into that.
He had a real zest for life, you can tell.
Oh, yeah. Such a zest for life.
Much ado has been made about him being influenced by Woody Allen, who preferred monologues to traditional jokes, Richard Pryor, who obviously confronted racism and contemporaneous problems. And it's pretty obvious you could see the combination of the two, but I think one underrated aspect of his comedy was his physicality. I mean, he was a really brilliant physical performer. The way he acted out some of his sketch, which comedian do you think he got that part from?
Well, I think that there was a healthy dose of Pryor in terms of learning to own the stage, but you already mentioned him, and I would say the only other person that really comes to mind, because you're right, when he was first starting out, it was Woody Allen, then Richard Pryor, and then Sam Kinison. I mean, Sam Kinison coming out of that same world of kind of Southern Baptist, the preacher, all of that stuff, and being such a larger than life presence on stage. I think Bill took a lot from that. He really did. And again, when you look at him when he's young, he's got he's certainly extremely comfortable on stage. You always feel that you're in the hands of a pro. You know, he really owns that space. But as he starts to evolve in his material, he also really almost starts to pace that stage like a tiger. He's really larger than life, and this wonderful kind of pantomimes that he does and all of that stuff. I think it's sort of reminds me of Kinison.
Yeah, sometimes I was rewatching Relentless last night, and sometimes he would just yell out one word, and the first thing I would think to myself, wow, that's exactly what Sam Kinison would do.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, no, I think that he was a young kid when he met Sam out at the Comedy Store. No, excuse me, pardon me. They met in Houston, but then they spent a lot of time out in Los Angeles together. So no, he was absolutely influenced by him. I think he took a lot of the great elements of Kinison, but frankly, he brought a sophistication and I don't know, discipline to it that, for me anyway, kind of finely tuned those very explosive impulses. With Hicks, you're watching it a bit more trained or something, and it's even more exciting. You know, there's a sense that Kinison would kind of lose control, and I think that Bill experimented with some of that when he was, particularly when he was drinking and everything. But once the drinking stopped, he had this really great way of being able to rein in the outrage to exactly the level that he wanted it. You could contain it, and it was therefore more powerful.
Hey, let's continue talking a little bit about some of the themes within his sets. He often discussed popular conspiracies and conspiracy theories in his performance. I mean, what sparked his government paranoia, or a lot of his hate of corporatocracy?
Well, again, I think that it's a sense from a very early age, probably having to do with, his own family, the sense that, the systems we're being presented with are not necessarily all they seem. So I think there's that questioning from a very early age about family systems, school systems, etc. To me, the conspiracy stuff, I think that he was mostly having fun with that. I don't know how seriously he took those things. I mean, he was no Alex Jones, but he did have a lot of fun with it. And I think that the part of it that spoke to him, I mean, I shouldn't say he was just having fun with it. He was really pretty obsessed with the Kennedy assassination, and with UFOs. I mean, Bill had a very elastic, expansive mind. And when it came to things like aliens, UFOs, I think that it had to do with a hope and an idea of there being something greater, sort of, that connects us all. I think it's almost kind of an outgrowth of spirituality and a wish for connectivity. With the Kennedy thing, I think that it really spoke to a basic distrust with the official story. And I think that that's where both of those things, like in a performance sense, really connect. It's question the official story, and I think that that's what a lot of that Kennedy material was about. I don't know how literally he took it. Maybe he did. I mean, a lot of people do. And who's to say? But that's the thing with him, is it was constantly question what you're being told. We should all be questioning everything all the time.
And that's really a rock and roll attitude. And I mean, he was probably more rock and roll than most rock and roll bands now, really, quite frankly.
Yeah.
And often great artists are influenced by other forums and mediums. For example, musicians are greatly influenced by some of the books that they read. I mean, outside of his obvious influences that he's talked about, Jimi Hendrix and Terence McKenna, I mean, who else inspired him outside of comedy?
The Rolling Stones, huge, the Beatles, I mean, music in general, rock and roll, and I think that has to do with the kind of, not just with the obvious rebellious aspect of it, but also, or the kind of outlaw aspect of it, but it also has to do with someone who has a real ear for rhythm. I mean, they say really good comedy is like music. And I think that that's a reason that a lot of really good comedians are also musicians, or they dabble strongly in music. I think there's a real connection there. And so, for me, when I listen to a great Hicks set, the rhythm and the timing of what he's doing is such a huge part of it. There's such a music to it. And I think in that way you can really feel the influence of rock and roll on him in a huge way.
And he was a pretty damn good musician too. He had, I believe, a couple musical albums, and he also had a relationship with Tool, who loved him.
Yes, absolutely.
How did that relationship between him and the band develop?
I'm trying to recall exactly what that was. I believe that what happened was that they were fans of his comedy. Maybe they had heard, they may have heard Rant and E Minor, or Dangerous, rather, excuse me. And then I know that Bill opened for them at Lollapalooza, and I think, if I'm not mistaken, that might have been the first time that they actually met. But yeah, I mean, Maynard Keenan, those guys, being real kind of spiritual seekers themselves, were very, very into Bill's whole, all his material, not just about shrooming, but about kind of the third eye and spirituality and all of those things. They thought it was great. I mean, he's kind of the only comedian that I can think of to date that's really gone in that direction, and really done a lot of material about spirituality.
Kind of a random question, because a lot of interviews and material has focused on the controversies that he's been part of. Letterman, obviously with the whole Dennis Leary ripping off part. So I feel like that's been talked a lot to death. And I mean, unless you have something new to add to the conversation, I'm more than ears.
No.
So I figured we can kind of skip over that part because it really has been talked to death. But something that I never really, at least, heard about too much. Did Bill ever have a special lady in his life?
Yes, he did. He tended to he tended not to be. I don't think somebody who dated a lot, but when he had a very serious relationship, it was kind of long and intense and all of that. And he was with a woman named Pamela for several years, who was a woman he had met in Houston. And then toward the end of his life, he was in a relationship with Colleen McGarr, who had been his friend, actually, for many, many years, and then had begun managing him with her partner. And they had a very deep relationship, and they were actually engaged when he died. So that was, but I wouldn't say that he was somebody who really let love and romance, although he was such a romantic, but I don't see him as somebody who was, bouncing from relationship to relationship. I think the real mistress was comedy. And again, he was so young, he was like, how it can be for people in their 20s when they're that intensely talented and they have that much they want to do and want to say. It's kind of like, let me do my work and, the rest will follow.
Yeah, we can't really talk about Bill Hicks without talking about his tragic death and his cancer diagnosis. But before I do, I kind of want to get something out of the way, just because if I didn't at least address it, I wouldn't be doing my due diligence, at least for my listeners. And everybody knows that we talk about conspiracy theories. We just touched on it before, and really the difference between the two. But some believe that the federal government killed him to shut him up. And, they've done it before, so I can't exactly say it isn't true, but in my personal opinion, I really didn't find anything to say so. And Bill himself didn't really help that situation, because a lot of times he would end his show with, I guess, acting out this mock assassination of himself. I mean, I haven't seen any smoking gun, but, I mean, did you find anything that says otherwise?
No, not at all. Not at all. I mean, in my opinion, I don't think that someone like Bill Hicks was a big enough priority to need to do something in such a ham-fisted way as I don't know what, inject him with cancer? I mean, is that the idea? No. I think that there are so many more sophisticated ways that they had of, if they wanted to keep someone quiet. I mean, that's the thing, is that our system was set up at that time to very neatly keep people like Bill marginalized. It wasn't like Bill was having this big success over here and, oh my God, what are we going to do about it? He's saying bad things about George W. Bush. About George Bush Sr. They had they had effectively marginalized him and kept him quiet. And a lot of that has to do with self-censorship. I mean, the David Letterman situation was a case of self-censorship, and as we all know, that's how this stuff works. It's not like some man in a gray suit appears from the government worried about what you're saying. So no, I don't think there's anything to that at all.
Now, I believe he was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer or stomach cancer that developed from the pancreatic cancer in June of '93, but he never really told too many people. He really only told his close friends and his family about his disease. Why did he keep the diagnosis to himself?
You know, I think that he very much wanted to believe that he was going to come through it. And I think there's that thing when you get diagnosed with something so terrifying, and frankly, that everyone knows is terminal, that you don't really want to be burdened with that as an identity. Do you know what I mean? I think that Bill's first reaction was, well, you know, how do we fight this? How do I fight this? How do I beat the odds? And for a lot of the time, I think Bill did believe that a miracle could occur and that he could beat the odds. And he was a young, strong man, and it's very unusual to get pancreatic cancer that young. So I think that he probably felt there was some logic behind that he might be that extreme minority. But I think the other thing was that, you know, his career was just going to big places over in the UK, and I think that he also was seeing some opportunities to have more of a voice in the United States, and I think it was so hurtful, the idea that something could stop that momentum. You know, he had so much going on, and I think that naturally he just wanted to bask in that and keep that momentum going forward rather than becoming like, you know, cancer guy. And, you know, so for a long time he managed not to be that and to enjoy another year of work and legacy creation. I mean, that was Bill's real focus, was let me get as much work out as I possibly can. I mean, I think in general that was a thing, but of course after diagnosis, he was really focused on getting things down, getting things recorded, getting work out there, pushing projects ahead. It's almost as though on stage was where he felt in control. And I think that to that end, he wanted to just keep putting out material and working as long as he possibly could, and probably hoping very much that there would be nothing to tell, that there would be a happy story to tell. I mean, I think that Bill fantasized about coming through cancer after having come through alcohol and drug addiction, or alcohol addiction, I should say, and then also surviving cancer, and he believed that it would be another part of his evolution as a human being. And I think that's what he was really focused on, was the miracle of coming through, the miracle that he was hoping for of surviving this horrible, aggressive cancer.
And a month and a half before he died, he did his final show in New York at Caroline's. What was that last show like?
My understanding is that very last show didn't go well. I think that was a case of someone's spirit being very much intact, but their physical self kind of deserting them, and he had to leave the stage mid-set, which was very sad. And reporters who were present were asked not to write about them, and I believe that pretty much nobody did. I think that people that night began to understand that something was going on. Unfortunately, there were some people who thought that he was back on drugs and alcohol, but, you know, I think that got pretty quickly, the word sort of started to go around a little bit about what was actually happening.
Now, he tragically died on February 26, 1994 in Little Rock, Arkansas, at the age of 32. Tell me, what were his last days like?
From what I understand, in his last days, he stopped speaking. But to back up just a little bit before that, I think that, you know, one thing that I understand was very important to Bill was this concept of coming full circle. And so in his last month, he went home to Little Rock to be with his parents. And, you know, Carlin, of course, came a lot, and they spent a lot of time together, as much as they possibly could. But it was very important to him that at the very end, it be he and his parents, his brother and his sister, the people that he had come into this world with. And I think that he and his mother had an opportunity to become close in a way that they hadn't been. I mean, certainly they were, they had a strong relationship throughout his life, but I think that they really reached a new understanding in that last month or so, and that was extremely important to him, and something that he took a lot of joy in was feeling that his mother understood what he was doing with his comedy and what it was about, and the way that for him it was essentially, he said, Mom, think of me as a preacher. I think a lot of happiness taken from that.
Today, a young man on acid realized that all matter is merely energy condensed to a slow vibration, that we are all one consciousness experiencing itself subjectively. There is no such thing as death. Life is only a dream, and we're the imagination of ourselves. Here's Thom with the weather. I mean, that was such a great line. I mean, did he really believe that death is only a dream?
I think he did. I think it's what he aspired to believe, certainly. I do. I could listen to that a million times, by the way. I think we should all listen to it every day, just that bit. I mean, what a great reminder before you go out into the world every day.
I think we'll probably throw that on here at the end. And before I let you go, because we only have a few more minutes, give us some final words and thoughts on Bill Hicks.
Oh, I feel like, as desperately sad as it is that Bill was taken so soon, and as easy it is to sit there and go, oh, but wouldn't you love to hear what he would say about such and such, and also just to see where he would be today. Sometimes I see people like Colbert, or Bill Maher, or whatever, and I think, oh, it would have been so different for him now. He would have been a really big voice in this country. While all of those things are true, as you touched on today, the material that is out there is so incredibly strong and so affecting and so relevant that the truth is we really still have him in a very contemporary, immediate way. His stuff is amazingly timeless. And you can't say that for all the greats. I don't think that's true, for example, of Lenny Bruce all the time, as much as I love him. His stuff was very much of a time period. And because Hicks really concerned himself with these larger questions as he went on, I just feel like we can all continue to enjoy, even if nothing else got released. It's like, I personally can listen to these sets, and I've listened to them all dozens and dozens of times. I can still listen to them with such pleasure, and they bring me a lot of comfort these days. So that's the main thing I would say. If you're feeling really blue and really crappy about what's happening in our country and feeling like, nobody gets it, this is your guy.
Cynthia, are there any copies left of your book, American Scream, The Bill Hicks Story? Can anyone even find them anymore?
Yeah, I have a few on my shelf.
All right. Well, then I might have to...
I think you can buy it on Amazon. There are some copies, and one of these days I'm going to put it out on Kindle.
I sure hope so. I think I saw... And don't be fooled, because I think I saw one copy selling for a very high price, so no reason to do that.
Yeah, I know. I should do something about that, huh? Put out some more.
Well, one of these days you'll get on that. Of course, this has been Cynthia True, and talking about her, sharing stories about Bill Hicks from her book and biography, American Scream. Cynthia, thank you so much for sharing these beautiful stories about Bill. Until the next one. The wrap-up begins now, so we can finally end. It's kind of a funny hypocrisy there. Huge thanks to three people. First, Steve Hicks, Bill Hicks' brother, who allowed this humble host to use all the clips that you're hearing throughout the night. Next, Hamill on Trial, who provided his own Bill Hicks tribute in the form of the song that you heard tonight, of the same name. And last, but certainly not least, our guest, Cynthia True. Please check out her book, American Scream, The Bill Hicks Story, for a little bit greater insight into the comic genius. Get all of her information on our website, themindseyemedia.com, and you can also read about next week's show, American Miracles. We're bringing on guest Adam Jortner, Associate Professor of History at Auburn University. We're going to converse about his latest book, Blood from the Sky, Miracles in Politics in the Early American Republic. You're going to find out how the American founders responded to the explosion of the supernatural in the decades following the Revolution. Remember, people, it's just a ride.